Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. I wanted to talk a little bit more about mechanics and storytelling. For people who are new to this channel, I will occasionally talk about some mechanic I've seen in tabletop RPGs or board games and how it makes me think about storytelling from a slightly different angle. Today, I want to talk about a card game called Miskatonic School for Girls. The basic premise of this card game is that you take the lead of a group of girls at a boarding school. This school, the Miskatonic School for Girls, is a boarding school somewhere in New England. The students are all young ladies with bright eyes, bright minds, and bright futures. The faculty are all eldritch abominations from another dimension bent on driving their students insane. So it's a pretty normal place except for the all-girls part. The Miskatonic School for Girls card game is a deck-building game. In deck-building games, players play by drawing a hand of cards. Those cards will give them resources which they can then use to buy more cards and add to their deck, getting more resources and usually scoring points in some way. Miskatonic School for Girls is different in that you don't actually score points. Rather, on your turn, you will add a card to your own deck, which represents a student at the school, and you will add a card to an opponent's deck, which represents the faculty at the school. After a couple of turns, faculty will start showing up in your hand, and your girls will have to go to class. The faculty will then slowly torture them and drive them insane until you as a player run entirely out of sanity and you lose. The last person standing wins. Miskatonic School for Girls is different from other games in its style because players do not actively attempt to better their own position. They try and make their opponent's position as bad as possible so they lose first. And this is weird because most people think of these kind of deck building games as a constructive exercise. But Miskatonic School for Girls turns the scenario on its head, and it becomes an exercise in tearing things down. And the game emphasizes this by only allowing you to spend your resources in one way or another. Every card will give you one of two types of resources. One is used to recruit girls for your deck, the other faculty for your opponent's deck. And the interesting thing about this is that the game can feel rather passive. You are not actively doing anything to your opponent. You are selecting hazards which they will then have to deal with on their own. And this is interesting because it feels somewhat active. You are attempting to defend yourself. But at the same time, it can feel like you are not doing anything at all. You're just throwing stuff in front of your opponent and hoping they trip over it. And yes, leaving a banana peel in the middle of a hallway is theoretically laying a trap for someone, but it doesn't feel very effective, at least at first glance. But as you begin to play Miskatonic School for Girls and dig into it, you begin to see the various layers of strategy, the ways you can adapt around it, and you realize that, yes, you are kind of doing something passive. You are just trying to forestall your own demise long enough to outlast the other players. But you are also gathering information. You are making choices about how you're going to try and trip up other people. You are noticing how they are defending themselves and trying to create obstacles for them that they cannot deal with. It's a very unconventional kind of gameplay, and it makes me think about an unconventional way to write characters. There is a belief in fiction writing that passive characters are no good. Passive characters are less interesting because rather than acting on their circumstances act on them. All they do is they react. All they do is they run, they scamper, they try and get an advantage, and it's not as interesting, we are told, as a character who's actively trying to pursue something and work their will on the world. I think this viewpoint is rather Nietzschean. There is a belief that people have to be the actor on the world at all times in order to be more fully realized than a person who is reacting. And that's not true. It's just not true. Everyone acts and reacts. But The reality is that most circumstances are beyond our control, and we can attempt to master them, but really all we're going to be doing is building frustration in ourselves. You can only account for the randomness of life so much. So you have to build mitigation for randomness into your life and then go about your business. And I think that if we look at a passive character through a lens of a person who's attempting to mitigate while still pursuing their own ends in a very sedate, kind of protracted way, as if they are trying to outlast something so they can continue along the course they were already on, we can see ways to write passive characters that are very, very interesting. Not so much as a person who is working their will on the entire world, but rather a person who has a goal in mind, who has something set out ahead of them, and who must navigate a minefield for a time in order to get there. There's a great example of this that I'm going to discuss in another video coming soon. But I wanted to lay out this example that came to me through this card game of a kind of directed passivity, kind of waiting for an opportunity. Because since we don't write these kind of characters very much, at least in Western literature, we are passing on a very strong and interesting character archetype that I would like to see more. And the character who builds and waits, a cultivating character, if you will, is an archetype that is semi-common in Eastern literature. And they are a person who has a lot of potential to build stories around. They're not necessarily interesting characters in and of themselves, but if they appear in a story, they have a lot to add to it. I don't know as I would like a cultivator to be a protagonist, but as a member of the supporting central cast, I think they have the potential to be very strong. And again, I'm going to talk about some examples of this in a follow-up video, probably on Friday. But if you really want to feel what this is like for yourself, and you don't want to spend years, slowly mitigating dangers and building up to a specific goal, I highly recommend checking out the card game Miskatonic School for Girls, because it really put this seed of an idea in my mind that there is a way to write a character who is just weathering the storm in a way that is not active, like you might see somebody in a disaster movie who's trying to escape or go somewhere, but in a way that is passive in a very directed sense. A character under siege, or a character who is hunkered down within a specific environment. And there are very interesting and specific writing techniques that will help you to write that character in a passive fashion that still interests the audience and encourages them to become invested in that story. Anyway, that's all I've got for you today, but hopefully you will come back on Friday to continue that discussion. In the meantime, tell me what your favorite deck builder is in the comments down below. There's a like button and a subscribe button there you can use as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.